Good morning everyone, welcome to today's GCSE English live group tutorial. Again, this is on paper 1 question 3 of your English Language GCSE paper, and this is part 3. So lots of you have joined us for parts 1 and 2 this week, where Vicky's been going through various features to include and various different extracts. So lots of you will be familiar with how these sessions run, but if you're new, this will be a 1-hour session, so we'll be finishing at 12, and there'll be sort of roughly 45 minutes of content, and then we'll have some time for any questions you may have at the end, that you can put in the chat or in the Q&A, which Vicky and I will keep an eye on throughout the session. And as always, this will be recorded, so if you want to watch back for revision purposes, you can access all of these recordings on the My Tutor YouTube channel, as well as some handy shorter videos that are related to all the topics in these webinars. So Vicky, someone's just asked, is this for AQA?
Yeah, so it's focusing on AQA, just because that's the most popular exam board by quite a long way in terms of schools. But sort of just general content in terms of the features that we're going to be learning and how we can apply them to the text. You can still use those in other exam boards. It's just how we write the answer that might vary a little bit usually.
Brilliant, thank you. And our tutor today, lots of you know her already, is Vicki, who has been with My Tutor for a really long time and is a trained English teacher. So you're in great hands today, and it should be a really brilliant session to wrap up the week. So if you're all ready, Vicki, then have a great session.
Fabulous. Right, good morning everybody. So yeah, we're just going to be carrying on with what we've been looking at for the rest of the week. I am using AQA as my sort of base, and how we're running through all of these sessions. So we did paper 1 question 2 last week, question 3 this week, and then question 4, question 5, etc. as we go along. So we are working through the AQA paper effectively, but there will be bits and pieces which you can definitely take away. So if you're not doing AQA, if you're doing OCR, EduCAS, EdXL, I can't think of any others, then you will still be able to take things away from it, so don't worry about it not being useful. So you can ask a question in the Q&A section. Yeah, it does finish at 12. Tilly's already answered that for you. Fantastic. Right, so same LO as the last couple of lessons as well. So warm-up activity then. So what do you know about paper 1 question 3? So what do you have to do? What bullet points are given to you, and how much text will you be faced with, and any other information if you want to throw it at me as well, that would be very welcome. So I will just give you a couple of minutes to send me some bits and pieces through. Whilst you're doing that, actually, I will quickly mention that some of you asked what are your recommendations for books that I should be reading, and I said I will come back with that for you today. So what I have done is I have compiled a list of all of the texts across all of the exam boards. I think I've got all of them. I apologise if I've missed one, but I think I've got them all. So there's a big list of all the Shakespeare texts, all the plays from 20th century, 21st century, 20th century novels, and 19th century novels as well. So I've got a big list which I'm going to go over with you at the end to give you some more ideas from what I already spoke to you about yesterday. Yeah, so we are analysing the whole source. 3 paragraphs of text, is that in terms of your answer? Because if it is, then yeah, you could say 3 paragraphs. But if you're talking in terms of the source that we're being given, you'll be looking at more than 3 paragraphs. I think we looked at 3 paragraphs yesterday, didn't we? But they were incredibly chunky paragraphs. Let me just double check. Yeah, they were only 3 paragraphs yesterday. It is an 8-mark question, absolutely. Describe structural features, and yeah, if you can use your context, that's always good as well. Right. I missed anything else? Right, so exam tips, yes, so that will be coming in part 4 when we've worked out where that is coming. I don't think there is a harder or an easier exam board. Yes, I'm going to go through stuff again, and if you're unsure about anything, do go back and watch the recordings from yesterday and the day before, so Wednesday and Thursday, and then you can stop and start it as you need to. So that might be helpful for you if I'm going too fast. Right, yeah, so I think we've pretty much covered everything apart from the bullet points. So the only thing that we didn't talk about is, your bullet points are how the writer focuses your attention at the beginning, how and why the writer changes the focus throughout the source, and any other structural features. Right, how many structural features can you remember, please? So this is my little rubbish mnemonic, so stop fez, but there are more than just stop fez, so throw some ideas at me, please. I'll give you another couple of minutes for that. Transition, zooming in and out, perspective, fab, fab, fab. Cyclical, start, setting, yeah, good. Repetition, yeah, repetition's a bit of a tricky one for this. You've got to be careful with it. Omniscient narrator, flashback, tone, yeah, flash forward. Over the shoulder, yeah, so that would be a perspective, type of perspective. I think we've picked out all of them, at least on there. I think the one that we're missing perhaps is ending, which is straightforward for the E there. And someone just popped it up, thank you very much, Millie. And the other one was pace, which I don't think we'd popped up. Right, so context then. So this extract is taken from 1984 by George Orwell. So it's written in 1949, so we're talking mid-20th century. This is the same author as Animal Farm. So George Orwell wrote both of those. Have I got them near me? No, I haven't. They're right at the bottom of a big pile. Right, so if you know Animal Farm, you might be familiar with sort of how George Orwell writes, what sort of themes he tries to tackle. He's quite a political writer. And they're both quite similar in the ways that they sort of portray Orwell's ideas. So 1984 then, so it follows a story following Winston. So Winston is a middle-aged man who's living in a society in which the government follows your every move. So the phrase Big Brother, so the TV programme where we watch 24 hours, what celebrities now, I don't know, I've never watched it, where we watch people sort of just live in a box. The phrase Big Brother comes from this book, so the idea that you are being watched constantly and everything that you do is being picked up and monitored by the government. So quite scary stuff. But it is a really interesting book, a really good read. This is as the text as a whole, it is on A-level syllabuses, just because it's a bit chunkier, it's a bit longer really. But if you are reading Animal Farm as your GCSE text, it might be worth going and having a read of 1984 as well, just to get a bit more of a feel of George Orwell and how he writes, because he is a fantastic writer. Right, okay, so let's have a crack at this extract. So, why have I only got half of it? Where has that gone? Oh dear. Right, let's just see if I can grab that. Sorry everyone, I didn't realise it had only uploaded half of it. Hopefully this will sort it out. There we go, cracking. Right, so question then. So the only thing that we need to sort of really bear in mind for our first read through is that it is from the beginning of the novel. So this is right at the very start. So we'll have a read through, then we'll go back, we'll do some annotations, and then we'll have a go at creating a waggle. And I'm going to call a bit more on you today in terms of why you think things are being done. Right, so it was a bright cold day in April. I apologise for my voice croaking, it's horrible. And the clocks were striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a coloured poster too large for indoor display had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a metre wide, the face of a man of about 45, with a heavy black moustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Even at the best of times, it was seldom working, and at present the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. On each landing opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about when you move. Big Brother is watching you, the caption below. Beneath it ran. Inside the flat, a fruity voice was reading out a list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice came from an oblong metal plaque, like a doll's mirror, which formed part of the surface of the right-hand wall. Winston turned a switch and the voice sank somewhat, though the words were still distinguishable. The instrument, the telescreen it was called, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. He moved over to the window, a smallish, frail figure, the meagreness of his body merely emphasised by the blue overalls which were the uniform of the party. His hair was very fair, his face naturally sanguine, his skin roughened by coarse soap and blunt razor blades and the cold of the winter that had just ended. Outside, even through the shut window pane, the world looked cold. Down in the street, little eddies of the wind were whirling dust and torn paper into spirals, and though the sun was shining and the sky a harsh blue, there seemed to be no colour in anything, except the posters that were plastered everywhere. The black mustachioed face gazed down from every commanding corner. There was one on the house front immediately opposite. Big Brother is watching you, the caption said, while the dark eyes looked deep into Winston's own. Down at street level, another poster torn at one corner flapped fitfully in the wind, alternately covering and uncovering the single word "ingsoc." In the far distance, a helicopter skimmed down between the roofs, hovered for an instant like a blue bottle, and darted away again with a curving flight. It was the police patrol snooping into people's windows. The patrols did not matter, however. Only the thought police mattered. Behind Winston's back, the voice of the telescreen was still babbling away about pig iron and the overfulfillment of the 9th 3-year plan. The telescreen received and transmitted simultaneously, and any sound that Winston made above the level of a very low whisper would be picked up by it. Moreover, so long as he remained within the field of vision which the metal plaque commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. How often or on what system the thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody all the time, but at any rate they could plug in your wire whenever they wanted to. You did live from habit that became instinct, in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and except in darkness, every movement scrutinised. Right, okay, what are our feelings towards this then? What are our initial thoughts? Any questions about words? Also welcome if there's something that you are unsure of, please fire them at me. So, I'll just give you a couple of minutes to have a look at that. Yeah, exactly. There is the theme of government and sort of power, dictatorship, definitely throughout both books. So if you are doing Animal Farm, I do suggest going off and reading this, because they are quite similar in terms of the messages they're trying to convey. Is the name Winston was coined by Is the name Winston was coined by Mr. Orwell due to Winston Churchill? Well, it wouldn't have been coined, because coined means making a new word. So, for example, or a new name. So, for example, J.M. Barrie created the name Wendy in Peter Pan, but this was written after Churchill was born. Churchill was born, late 1890s, I think. So, that was a name that was knocking about for quite some time. So this is from 1984. What is a varicose ulcer? Yeah. Right. So an ulcer is, I'm sure we've all had mouth ulcers. We know what those are. So an ulcer is sort of a hole in the skin, effectively. And varicose is to do with veins, so it would be affecting the veins and the blood flow. So quite a nasty little ailment to have, and could cause some serious damage if not looked after properly. Does the number 13, clock striking 13, is that significant? I think it absolutely is. Yeah. So 13 obviously being 1 in the afternoon. But yes, I think that probably is very significant and done purposefully. Sanguine. So that comes from Latin meaning blood. So he's sort of blood red, very pink in the face. Can you use capitalisation as a structural feature? No. Is it a structural feature? I think it's more of a presentational feature. So I would say the capitalisation is significant, but I would tie it into a structural feature, which we will talk about, tying that in, because that is something that I have to talk about with you guys in a bit. Right, so in year 10, want to improve vocabulary. Is it too late? Absolutely not. When I was in year 10, my vocabulary wasn't very good. I read quite a lot, and it improved significantly within about 6 months. So it's absolutely not too late. So perhaps reading some of the books I'm going to suggest at the end of the lesson would be a good idea in terms of building your vocabulary. So stepping away from sort of young adult teen fictions, just because they're a little more simplistic in vocabulary. INGSOC, yeah, I can't remember what INGSOC is. It is a organisation which helps run the Think Police, I think. Right, have we got anything else? To the person who said it was depressing, absolutely, yeah, scrutinise, that's a really nice way to put it. Right, okay, so let's run through this all then. Let me just grab a pen and then we will get cracking. Right, so I think the first good thing to do is look at each paragraph and say what the focus is, and then we can track the change in focus. So first paragraph, it was a bright cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass door of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swell of gritty dust from entering along with him. So, what is the main focus in that paragraph then? Yeah, so Harry Potter in year 10. Yeah, that was sort of what I was trying to get at with teen fiction, to be honest with you. Harry Potter is great. I've recently reread it all, but it's not hugely challenging in terms of vocabulary. So reading Harry Potter instead of nothing is better than nothing effectively, but try and branch out into some adult books as well. Right, so someone said focus on the environment. Yeah, I think we can make an argument for environment or weather. So either of those two. Right, so we've also got cold here and wind, which I'm going to underline and we will come back to. We've also introduced Winston, but we've literally just introduced him. We don't really know anything about him. We haven't got really any characterisation going on so far. Right. So the hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a colour poster too large for indoor display had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a metre wide, the face of a man of about 45 with a heavy black moustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift, even at the best of times it was seldom working, and at present the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39, had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle. Went slowly, resting several times on the way. On each landing opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about when you move. Big Brother is watching you, the caption beneath it ran. So focus this time, expanding more on environment and setting. What are our opinions of the environment and setting? Do we think, oh yeah, we definitely want to go live there? How do we think Winston feels about living there as well, from what we've found out so far? What are our opinions? Oh, P.D. James books. I have absolutely no idea. I've never read any, I'm afraid. Yeah, so wind's slippery, yeah. It's unusual, suggests that things are quite unpleasant in smell. Yeah, it sounds grim, doesn't it? It sounds like it's not cared for at all. I'll come back to how we improve vocabulary in terms of reading books at the end. Just shout at the end and we'll talk about it a little bit more. It is quite dull. I think if I was going to sort of paint this, I think I would be using a lot of grey. Third person narrator, yeah, it seems to be what we would call free indirect. So free indirect is just unbiased and just objective rather than over the shoulder. Yeah. What else have I suggested? So I think we could also talk about characterization of Winston a little bit now. So we find out that he's got a varicose ulcer, which seems a pretty grim thing to tell us, but perhaps that tells us something about the healthcare system and how people are valued by society, maybe. So that might be a clue towards that. We have enormous face repeated twice, which there's a lot of repetition in this, so that's important to discuss. So we've got characterization here. We've got repetition. Anything else? Right. And I think we've got Big Brother watching you later. Yes. So we've got repetition within the paragraph, and we've also got Big Brother is watching you, and that comes later, I think, in paragraph 5. So lots of repetition there. Yeah, and we're mainly still focusing on the environment. It's basically an extension of the first paragraph, isn't it? We're getting a little bit about Winston, but we're not getting a very clear, concise description where we're being told lots of information. They're sort of like, it's sort of dribbling in occasionally. Right, So, inside the flat, a fruity voice was reading out a list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice came from an oblong metal plaque, like a doll's mirror, which formed part of the surface on the right-hand wall. Winston turned a switch, and the voice sank somewhat, though the words were still distinguishable. The instrument, the telescreen it was called, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. He moved over to the window, a smallish, frail figure, the meagreness of his body merely emphasised by the blue overalls which were the uniform of the party. His hair was very fair, his face naturally sanguine, his skin roughened by coarse soap and blunt razor blades, and the cold of the winter had just ended. Right, so what is the focus of this paragraph? Yeah, so yeah, it has a war feeling, doesn't it? Sort of, particularly the one where your country needs you, but it seems a lot more sinister. Yeah, so we're talking about physical description of Winston then. So so most of it, oops, it's not helpful. Right, so pretty much all of this here is characterisation of Winston. Yep, right, so focus then is mainly this, as well as we've got a little bit more of what's going on in the flat. So we're developing our knowledge of this particular society. Now, I will be very impressed if any of you can tell me what, shall we say, what genre this is, this belongs to. This type of very negative atmosphere. It's got a specific name. Yeah, someone said it. Yeah, fantastic dystopian. Yeah. So, but be careful with how you're spelling dystopian. So it's spelled with a Y. So those of you who said mystery, thriller, gothic. So yeah, absolutely, there is a sense of mystery. Although usually when we look at mystery genre, we're sort of looking at it's usually things like Agatha Christie, you know, murder mysteries, people dying and us working out how that's come to be. Whereas with this, that's not really the case. I would say there's a definite sense of thriller, because it seems a very dangerous place to be living. So I think there's a very good, strong argument with that one. What was the other one somebody said? Gothic. So now with Gothic is usually something that was happening in the 19th century in terms of a genre. So things like Dracula and Frankenstein, and I think The Raven. So that would have things like, you know, supernatural, things like vampires and monsters, those ghosts, that sort of thing. Whereas with this is just sort of like technology. So it wouldn't be gothic, but nice thought nevertheless. Right. Yeah, it's definitely an adult book. Yeah, so there might well be a simile, but remember we are doing question 3, so we aren't focusing on language devices and features. So although it's great that you've spotted that, we can't talk about it because that's question 2, not question 3. Definitely a load of detailed description on Winston. Yeah, I think there's probably sort of a little synthetic fallacy going on, but again, that's your question 2, your language devices and features. So definitely, what does it mean by fruity voice? I think it's probably something that's sort of quite well rounded and energetic and emphatic, which is probably quite a stark it's a stark contrast, isn't it, compared to everything else that we found out so far. So you could potentially say that that's a juxtaposition, but again, that's question 2, not question 3. Right, so now I think from developing this knowledge of society and sort of working out that we're looking at something that's probably quite dystopian, we're starting to build tension. Right, outside, even through the shut window pane, the world looked cold. Down in the street, little eddies of wind were whirling dust and torn paper into spirals, and though the sun was shining and the sky a harsh blue, there seemed to be no colour in anything except the posters that were plastered everywhere. That's quite interesting, the idea that although there is colour, there isn't. So it's almost like they're in a polarised black and white society, which is quite interesting. So I think already we're now sort of starting to look at zooming out, aren't we? We've initially sort of zoomed in and looked on Winston. Now we're looking at the bigger picture of what the world looks like under this rule. Right. The black mustachioed face gazed down from every commanding corner. There was one on the house front immediately opposite. Big Brother is watching you. So again, we've returned to this face which seems to be everywhere. So we've got this repetition that it's inescapable, effectively, I suppose we could say. Right, so the caption said, while the dark eyes looked deep into Winston's own. Down at street level, another poster, torn at one corner, flapped fitfully in the wind, alternatively covering and uncovering the single word Ingsoc. In the far distance, a helicopter skimmed down between the roofs, hovered for an instant like a blue bottle, so we've got simile there, but we can't talk about it, and darted away again with a curving flight. It was the police patrol snooping into people's windows. The patrols did not matter, however, only the thought police mattered. Right, so with this one then, I could say, there's zooming out, there's repetition. We're now looking, the weather seems to have, so we've sort of come back to the weather. So I think this paragraph and the first paragraph are quite similar in that so I mean first paragraph, I do mean first paragraph. So these two here, first and second, are quite similar in that they're covering the same sort of themes, ideas. They're coming back again. Right, and then we're sort of continuing our understanding. So focus is on sort of, I suppose, wider world or area. Should we go wider area? Because we don't know that this is across the entire world. This could be just a country or a section of a country. So we're focusing on the wider area and how the area is being governed. So we've got the thought police being mentioned, police patrol, and the fact that they're just going around in helicopters looking into people's windows. It sounds absolutely terrifying. Right, so let's move on. Let's see if I've missed anything. Yeah, you're right, alliteration. So, right, is repetition a language device or structural feature? Yeah, it's both, but you have to be very careful. So, in terms of repetition, so if you were talking about repetition of words, then they need to be across more than one paragraph. So, for example, we've got this in the first paragraph. So we've got cold and wind, and they are repeated. We've got wind here and cold here. So repetition of the weather and it sort of being inescapable, we could say that as a structural feature because they are far apart from each other. Now, if you said it was a bright cold day in April, the clocks are striking 13, Winston Smith, who was feeling the cold, that would be a language device because they are really close to each other. So they need to be spread out across paragraphs, across the text, in order for you to be able to talk about it as a structural device. The other type of repetition is the repetition of ideas. So throughout this, we've got the repetition of being watched. They're sort of being in a sense of fear, the repetition of sort of this grey atmosphere, the weather being repeated. So we could talk about all of that. Repetition in terms of returning to the man with the poster, and that's everywhere, and Big Brother is watching you as well. That being repeated, so there's loads and loads of repetition in this. So two different types of repetition you just need to be careful with. If you're looking at repetition of words, they need to be far away and sort of sprinkled around. Yeah, so this is definitely like tyranny, isn't it? So yeah, so pathetic fallacy is when the weather reflects a mood. However, that is a language device, not a structural feature, so we can't talk about it. However, we can talk about the idea of the weather coming. We're introduced to the weather, we go off and look at some other stuff, and then we come back to the weather. So we could talk about that as a structural feature. Right, let's have a look at the last paragraph so we can get going at writing an answer. So, behind Winston's back, the voice from the telescreen is still babbling away about pig iron. So we've come back to this idea of pig iron. It seems to be completely inescapable, this telescreen, and the ever-fulfilment of the 9th 3-year plan. So there seems to be quite a lot of propaganda going on here. So can anyone tell me what propaganda is? And whilst you're doing that, so focus then being tends to be our focus is being watched, definitely so far, and it goes into talking about the thought police. Right. To that kid, yes you can. Yeah, a poster, not necessarily a poster, it can be any type of media that delivers a particular sort of message. So I'm sure you've probably all done at some point at school World War II posters. So a lot of them are sort of very guilt-tripping and make you feel like a terrible person if you don't go off to war, so that would be propaganda. Nazi Germany had a huge amount of propaganda, which is how they sort of implemented Jews being killed and why that was a good thing to be doing. So yeah, propaganda can be really dangerous stuff. Right, so the television screen received and transmitted simultaneously. Any sound that Winston made above the level of a very low whisper would be picked up by it. Moreover, so long as he remained within the field of vision with the metal plaque commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment, how often, or on what system the thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork. So, and that goes on more to talk about being watched. So the main focus then is being watched, thought police. We've returned back to the thought police. So it's first mentioned here and then it's mentioned here. So we've got quite a nice transition going on there. So that paragraph setting up for the next paragraph. Right, so we've talked about the start, we've looked at the setting a little bit, haven't we? Omniscient narrator, we don't have one of those. We've decided we have a free indirect narrator, so we don't have somebody who's saying all of this is happening because of this and this is what's going to happen to Winston now. That's what an omniscient narrator is. We don't have one of them. Perspective, free indirect narrator, although we're looking a little bit over Winston's shoulder. So to start off with, generally, the focus isn't so much Winston, it's what's going on around Winston. He's sort of just there for reference, I suppose. But we could say it's a little over the shoulder because we're told stuff about Winston. Right, flashback or flash forwards, we don't have a change of time, so we can't talk about that. Ending, so I suppose we could talk about at the start. It just seems to be quite a miserable place to be. At the end, you're being scrutinised constantly. So there's a huge change from the first to the last paragraph that we've got. and zooming in and out. So we zoom in on Winston and then we zoom back out to look at the wider area and how everybody's being effective in general terms. We've talked about repetition, pace. What do you think about pace, guys? I think in terms of tone, I think this is sort of very bleak dystopian, which we talked about. Pace, I think this is quite steady, just because things are being withheld from us. So we're not being told why Big Brother is watching, how that's affecting. So I think that's just in terms of being able to release those pieces of information further on. I think we've pretty much sort of done our little tick list from there then. So this is pretty much everything that we have looked at. I don't think there's anything I haven't mentioned there, so I'm going to move on. So in terms of choosing our paragraphs then, so I'm going to look at focus at the beginning. I'm going to have a look at the repetition of the same focuses. I'm also going to look at some transitions as well. I'm just aware that I'm sort of need to get through this because it's getting towards 2:15. Right, so let's have a go then. So Orwell, so I'm showing that I know who the author is and I've read. The information chooses to focus the reader's attention. So I'm using language from the questions, so I'm making it very clear that I know that I'm answering this question at the beginning on the miserable weather. So brief point there. I'm then going to put my embedded quotation, so escape the vile wind. Make sure that I put my full stop inside the quotation mark. This sets the tone of the piece as being negative. The unavoidable, horrible weather is once again returned to. So I'm now saying, well, this is our focus at the beginning, and this is where it's returned to later. The focus is the same later on. So return to in paragraph 4. So I'm making it clear that I know which paragraph it's in. Right. The world looked cold. So by repeating the focus of the weather, of weather, Orwell makes it feel that the should we say unpleasant, the unpleasantness of the weather is inescapable, like the government's watch. So a relatively basic paragraph there, but I've talked about why he would want to return, and what really sort of seals the deal here is that I'm drawing the parallel between the weather being inescapable, like the government's watch. So I'm talking about sort of Big Brother watching, and I'm talking about why that's relevant. So let's have a look at the next one. So the second paragraph, transitions. So now I'm sort of ticking off the other structural features. I've also ticked that off with tone as well, where I've mentioned that, into describing Winston's living conditions. So depicted simply an enormous face. So this initially creates questions in the reader's mind, as it is unusual in our daily life, say living, to see a picture of a large face. I suppose we see it in terms of sort of outside, but we don't see it inside. That's not something we would expect, so make that clear. So inside our living conditions. Orwell continues to describe the man, therefore creating tension as the purpose of this poster isn't revealed until the last sentence of the paragraph. So Big Brother is watching you. This creates a sense of dystopia, so that sort of means end of the world. Making the reader feel uneasy about what Winston is living through. Right, so I've ticked off all 3 bullet points today. So yesterday I think I only did 1 and 3. So where's my question? There we go. So yesterday I only spoke about the focus at the beginning and other structural features. Today I've done all 3 because I've talked about the focus at the beginning and then where the focus comes back to the same thing in paragraph 4. And I've also thrown in extra structural features like creating tension, tone and repetition as well. But I could expand on this further, but I'm just aware that we haven't got a lot of time left. Right, so in terms of, let's go back to the person who asked, how do I improve my vocabulary just by reading? So the answer to that one is you naturally tend to absorb it and you start to just learn the vocabulary and it sort of sticks in your head. At least with me, I didn't do anything in particular to boost my vocabulary other than read. I just read. What I would suggest is perhaps if you are reading, when you are reading, pick out a few words that you think, oh, I'm not quite sure what those mean. If you can't work them out contextually, and go and look them up afterwards, and then perhaps try and think about putting them into sentences, using them, that sort of thing, in order to build your vocabulary. Right. Yeah, so that would be a top band mark. So in terms of his repetition, structural, or language feature, I've gone over that a couple of times. So it's structural if the repetition of words is over more than 1 paragraph, and repetition in terms of ideas coming back and being seen throughout the text. If it's just repetition of a couple of words within a paragraph together, then that would be a language device. Genre, no, not as a structural feature. Yeah, I suppose this could be a narrative hook. It's not based on true story. This is a prediction by Orwell of what he thought the world was going to be like in 1984. Is Goodnight, Mr. Tom a good book to read? Yeah, I have put it up as I think a question 2. I read it earlier this year. It is a nice book, but it is a children's book. So yeah, absolutely do read it, but it might not be particularly challenging if you are looking to improve your vocabulary. So some of you yesterday said, can you please give us some ideas as to, well, a few of you said, as to what I should be reading, what's good to read. So this is a huge list of everything that is on all of the GCSE syllabuses. So what I'm hoping to do is to have this released for you in terms of in the resource pile when that's sort of sorted out, so you can go have a look at these. So some of these you will be studying. So 20 and 21st century plays, I'd say those would be good to watch if you could find them on YouTube, because sort of reading, I'm sure you know that reading a play isn't quite the same as reading a book, just because there isn't a lot of very difficult vocabulary in plays generally in terms of sort of detailed description, because it's just not there, because it's just dialogue, apart from a few stage directions. So definitely sort of go look at them in terms of sort of questioning and practicing how you can look at things and understanding themes, context, that sort of thing. That's a really good thing to do. But in terms of actual reading, I would say your best bet to start is with the 20th and 21st century prose. So there's a huge range of stuff here. So I'd definitely go off and start with some of those. If you want to go back a bit further and challenge yourself a bit more, have a go at some 19th century novels, just because the language tends to be a bit more dense and I say sophisticated. The grammatical structures are a bit more sophisticated, so I do think 19th centuries are a bit more of a challenge. I would suggest War of the Worlds. I think that's quite a nice read. I think so is Christmas Carol. I think you can read anything by Conan Doyle. So he's the writer of Sherlock Holmes, perhaps Hound of Baskerville. The Sign of Four that I've got comes with The Study in Scarlet as well, so that might be quite nice. In terms of other authors, I think Agatha Christie might be quite nice to read for 20th century. She's got absolutely loads of books. So I think there's sort of something for everyone there in terms of what sort of thing. I mean, you've got the obvious things like Miss Marple and Poirot, but she does lots of standalones as well and short stories, which would perhaps be quite nice to look at some short stories. Margaret Atwood is also very good for short stories, so she might be a good author to look at as well. We've read Blood Brothers in school and have developed a lot more vocabulary ideas. Yeah, so absolutely, I think you can definitely take stuff away from plays, just in terms of if you are really focusing on looking at vocabulary, something that is a bit denser will help, because there's just more words there. That's sort of what I'm trying to get at. In terms of where can you find these books, I think I bought most of mine from Waterstones, but I'm sure you can get them on Amazon or anything like that. I'm sure you can get hold of most of these quite easily, because they're all sort of quite popular literary books. What am I currently reading? I'm currently reading a book called Invisible Women, which is about data bias, which is quite interesting. So I recommend that. That's sort of feminism literature. Is Of Mice and Men challenging? Yeah, so Of Mice and Men is only on one of the exam specifications now. I think it's on Educast WJC. Most schools now tend to teach it as a year 8, year 9 text, because it was at some point considered too easy. I don't think there's any harm in you reading Of Mice and Men. I think it's perfectly legitimate and fine to read, because I think some of the ideas in there are really challenging, so I think it's absolutely fine. Yeah, so in terms of recommending for younger years, what I would say is start with some of these prose books, because it's quite common for schools to teach some of these books at lower levels. So I know schools that teach To Kill a Mockingbird, Animal Farm, Of Mice and Men, I think Anita and Me, Lord of the Flies, Woman in Black. I think those are the only ones that I've heard of, that I've personally heard of. I'm sure there's other ones that teach these at a lower level. So although these are GCSE texts, they're absolutely fine for you to read. at a younger age, your understanding might be a little more simplified than if you read it when you're in year 11, just because you don't have the world knowledge that you do as you go along. So yeah, I think those are fine to read for year 8. I mean, sort of the obvious choices are Harry Potter and Percy Jackson, those sort of things. Skullduggery Pleasant, you know, those are fine, but if you're reading it and think, oh, I know what all of these words mean, I don't have to stop and think, what does that mean? I need a little bit of help. Then try and find something a little bit more challenging. If you are reading them and thinking, yeah, this is okay for me, I'm having to work stuff out, and that's fine, stick with those. It's purely based on what you think works for you. Haven't read The Lie Tree. No. Oh, missed one there that just popped up. Oh no, perhaps I didn't. Yeah, so in Spectacles, Jekyll and Hyde, those are really common ones that are taught. Oh, I don't know about The Railway Children. I've never read it. I've seen the film, but I imagine it probably would be. Probably be a good level for you. Any other questions about question 3? Anything that you're still unsure of that you want me to go over in more detail when we get to rescheduling that part 4? Is there anything that you think, oh gosh, I'm not quite sure what she's on about and I need her to slow down and tell me in more detail? So shout those out to me, please. Reading summaries before reading the actual book. That's a very good question. I mean, I read, in terms of when I select books, I read the blurb and I read the first couple of pages to see whether I fancy it. So I wouldn't, because I think it spoils the joy of reading personally. Tips for learning poems. Yeah, it is a nightmare, isn't it? Because it is a memory test. It's not open book, which I think is a shame. So I think learning your key themes, picking out maybe 2 or 3 really strong quotations from each one would be a good place to start, and learning a little bit about context. I think that would be a good foundation for you. Yeah, I do tend to read the book before watching the film because I feel like it spoils it, and the book's usually better just because there's time for more detail. Hamlet's a play, which is an A-level text. So absolutely go see if you can find a version of it on YouTube maybe, or see if you can get a DVD, or what I've done when I'm reading plays is I try and find a recorded version and I can follow along with the script, just because I find it a lot easier to understand what on earth everything is going on. So I always think that's a good thing to do. I think there's 4 or 5 exam boards. Right, anything else on question 3 quickly? Yeah, I'll scroll down to the rest of that for you. I think that's pretty much everything, Tilly. Is there anything else I haven't answered that you found?
There was just a couple of people asking earlier, could you just recap the meaning of pathetic fallacy and propaganda?
Yeah, so pathetic fallacy is where the weather reflects a mood. So, for example, in 1984, sort of the mood of being watched and so everything being quite bleak is represented by the window because it's windy, it's grey outside, it's quite a dull atmosphere. If you're looking to portray a happy sort of mood, then you might have sunny weather, that sort of thing. Propaganda is media that is produced by a government in order to persuade you to think in a certain way. So, for example, British World War II, it would be to persuade you for men to go to war and for women to sort of dig for victory and do the men's jobs whilst the men go away and fight the war, that sort of thing. It can be to persuade, it can sometimes be a bit more sinister in terms of manipulation.
Great, thank you. I think that looks like all the questions. Just a reminder, guys, that next week we will be wrapping up with one more session on question 3 and then moving on to question 4. So stay tuned over the weekend for the timetable for next week. That should be coming through really soon for you. Thank you for attending today, and if this is the last one of the week, have a great weekend. If not, then I'm sure we'll see lots of you in the remaining 2 sessions, which is GCSE Maths in 15 minutes on Venn diagrams and Physics at 2 on forces and motion part 2. So thanks very much, Vicky, for today's session. That was brilliant, and hopefully see you guys all soon. Bye, guys.
Bye.